My name is Ashley Miller. I'm 38 years old, and my parents didn't whisper it behind my back. They said it right to my face like it was my legal name, not Ashley, not their daughter, just the dumb one. I grew up in a beige two-story house in Dayton, Ohio. The kind of place where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen, and yet somehow everything did. My older brother Mark was the smart one, the golden child. The kid whose report cards went on the fridge and whose mistakes were called learning experiences. My younger sister Emily was the pretty one. The one who learned early that smiling at the right time could bend the world slightly in her favor. And then there was me, stuck in the middle like a misprint, quiet, awkward, slow to answer, always thinking 3 steps past the conversation and missing the moment where I was supposed to speak. I didn't test well, I didn't raise my hand, I didn't defend myself, so they filled in the silence for me. At family dinners, my father, Richard, would chuckle when I struggled to explain something and say, "You know Ashley's not built for this kind of thinking." My mother, Deanne, would sigh like my existence was a chore she'd been assigned unfairly and add, "She has other qualities." They never named those qualities, just implied they existed somewhere offstage. Like a deleted scene, no one would ever watch. By the time I was 12, it wasn't an insult anymore, it was a category. Teachers picked it up during parent conferences. Friends absorbed it without malice. Even I started using it as shorthand. "I'm the dumb one," I'd say, smiling so people wouldn't feel uncomfortable about agreeing. The thing about being underestimated for long enough is that people stop watching you. They don't guard their words. They don't lock their doors. They don't imagine you could understand what you're seeing, let alone remember it. And that's how I learned. I learned that my father didn't really work late on Tuesdays. I learned that my mother's charity committee lunches were cash only and very selective. I learned that Mark's college fund wasn't just a college fund. I learned that the house was refinanced 3 times without anyone talking about why. I learned because no one thought I was capable of connecting dots. When I left for college, it wasn't with applause or speeches or a going-away party. I went to a small state school 2 hours away, studied accounting because numbers didn't care if you were charming, and lived in a dorm room that smelled like dust and burned coffee. My parents told people I was figuring things out, which was code for not worth discussing. I didn't call home much. They didn't notice. After graduation, I moved to Columbus, took an entry-level job at a regional investment services firm, and learned how money actually moves when no one is trying to impress anyone else. I learned how shell companies work. I learned how trusts are layered. I learned how people hide in plain sight behind paperwork so boring it feels like a punishment to read. And I learned patience. 10 years passed, then 15. I didn't post much online. I didn't correct assumptions. When relatives asked what I did, I said I worked in finance and let their eyes glaze over. When my mother told people Mark was helping manage family assets, I smiled and nodded like that made sense. What no one knew was that the quiet girl who couldn't explain herself at dinner had been listening the entire time. What no one knew was that I had been building something separate, something airtight, something boring enough to be invisible. What no one knew was that while my parents were skimming and shuffling and congratulating themselves for outsmarting the system, I had been documenting everything, every transfer, every false statement, every forged signature, not because I was angry, because I was thorough. The call came on a Thursday morning while I was standing in line for coffee. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something in me said answer. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and very careful with its words. He said his name was Thomas Reynolds, and he represented a private equity firm finalizing a long-term acquisition involving assets held in a trust I controlled. I remember laughing softly and saying, "I think you have the wrong Ashley." There was a pause, just long enough to tell me he was smiling on the other end. "No," he said. "I'm very sure." We scheduled a meeting for the following week. I didn't tell anyone. Not a friend, not a coworker, certainly not my family. I showed up in a navy blazer I'd owned for years and sat across from men who had spent their lives being listened to. They explained the deal. They explained the valuation. They explained the final number slowly, like they were bracing for confusion. $47 million, not projected, not theoretical, a check. They slid the folder across the table, and I felt something shift, not excitement, not shock, but a quiet alignment, like something heavy had finally settled into its correct place. I signed where they told me to sign. I asked 2 questions, both precise, both necessary. Thomas nodded once like he'd been waiting for them. When I walked out of that building, the city looked the same, traffic still angry, skies still gray. But I felt taller somehow, not because of the money, but because of what it confirmed. I wasn't wrong. I never had been. The email from my mother came 2 days later, subject line all caps, urgency leaking through the screen. "We need to talk." I read it twice before responding with a single word. "Okay." The family dinner was scheduled for Sunday. Same house, same table, same seating arrangement that had been silently enforced since childhood. Mark talked loudly about his latest venture. Emily showed off her engagement ring. My parents beamed. I ate quietly, listened carefully, and waited. When my father finally turned to me with that familiar smile, the one that meant he was about to make a joke at my expense, I met his eyes and didn't look away. "So, Ashley," he said, chuckling, "still crunching numbers for someone smarter." The table laughed. I reached into my bag, slow enough that no one felt threatened yet, and placed the envelope on the table between the salt and pepper. It was thick, official, and very real. My mother frowned. My father stopped smiling. "I got paid this week," I said. My voice didn't shake. "For something I've been working on for a long time." Mark leaned forward. Emily tilted her head. "How much?" my father asked, already calculating how this could somehow involve him. $47 million, I said. The silence wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It was confused, disbelieving, scrambling. My mother laughed too loudly. My father opened the envelope with hands that had suddenly aged 10 years. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't going to be about money at all. It was going to be about everything they assumed I was too dumb to notice. No one touched their food after I said the number. The roast sat in the center of the table, cooling, forgotten, like it suddenly didn't matter anymore. My father's eyes moved faster than his thoughts, scanning my face for the punchline he was sure had to be coming. My mother's smile froze halfway between polite and panicked. Mark's mouth opened slightly, then closed again, like he was buffering. Emily looked at me the way you look at a stranger who somehow knows your name. $47 million doesn't land like a joke. It lands like a dropped plate. Loud, final, impossible to ignore. My father cleared his throat and laughed once more, weaker this time. "All right," he said, waving a hand. "That's enough, very funny." He slid the envelope back toward me like it was embarrassing him. "You don't have to play pretend." I didn't argue. I didn't correct him. I just reached into my bag again and placed my phone on the table, screen already lit. Bank confirmation. Wire receipt. My name spelled correctly. The kind of numbers that don't need commas explained. That's when my mother stopped breathing for a second. I noticed because she always did that when something scared her. Held her breath like if she didn't inhale, reality might pause too. "This isn't yours," Mark said finally. His voice had an edge I'd never heard before, sharp and defensive. "You didn't build anything," I nodded. "I know." That seemed to throw him off. He was ready to argue, not to be agreed with. "I didn't build it loudly," I added. "I didn't announce it." "I didn't need to." My father's face hardened. "Where did you get this money?" I met his gaze again. "From assets I own." "You don't own anything," he snapped automatically, the way he'd said it my entire life. Then he stopped, because this time it didn't sound true even to him. I picked up my phone and put it back in my bag. "You're right," I said. "I didn't own anything you could see." The room felt smaller. The walls, once familiar, felt like they were leaning in, listening. My mother spoke next, soft, careful. Ashley, if this is some kind of misunderstanding, we can help you fix it. I almost smiled. She still thought this was something broken. There's no misunderstanding, I said, and I don't need help. My father pushed his chair back slightly, the legs scraping against the floor. Then explain it, he said. Explain how someone like you ends up with that kind of money. Someone like you. Same words, same tone, same assumption. So I explained, but not the way he expected. I paid attention, I said. When people talked around me instead of to me. When documents were left out because no one thought I'd read them. When conversations stopped the second I walked into a room because no one thought I'd understand what was already said. Mark scoffed. You're saying you just notice things? I'm saying I noticed everything. My mother shook her head. This is ridiculous. Is it? I asked. Then why did you refinance the house in 2009 using a trust that didn't legally exist yet? The color drained from her face so fast it was almost impressive. My father stood up. What did you say? I said, I repeated calmly, that the Miller family trust was filed 3 months after you used it as collateral. Silence again, this one heavier. Mark laughed nervously. You don't know what you're talking about. I do, I said, because I filed the correction paperwork. That did it. My father slammed his hand on the table. You had no right. I tilted my head. To fix illegal filings or to notice them? Emily finally spoke, her voice small. Why are you doing this? That was the first honest question of the night. I'm not doing anything, I said. I already did it, years ago. Quietly, I looked around the table at the people who raised me, who labeled me, who built an entire narrative around my supposed incompetence, and I felt something surprising. Not anger, not revenge. Relief. You see, I continued, while you were busy moving money between accounts you thought no one else could track, I was learning how to track it better than you ever could. My father's jaw tightened. You're accusing us of something. I'm not accusing, I said. I'm explaining why the check cleared. My mother sat down slowly, like her legs had stopped trusting her. What check? She whispered. The one from the firm that acquired controlling interest in the assets you thought you managed, I said. The ones held under my name. Mark shot to his feet. That's impossible. It wasn't, I said. It was paperwork, lots of it, boring paperwork, the kind no one reads carefully. He looked at my father. My father didn't look back. That's when I realized something else. This wasn't new information to all of them. Some of it was just new to me that they knew. You knew, I said, looking at Mark. Didn't you? He swallowed. Dad said it was temporary. I nodded. That you were the beneficiary until I figured things out. My father didn't deny it. I was 19, I said softly. You filed documents in my name without explaining them because you thought I wouldn't understand. My mother covered her mouth. You moved money through entities you controlled, I went on. You used my social security number because it had no flags, no credit, no history. Mark's voice cracked. You were supposed to be a placeholder. I met his eyes. Placeholders still exist. The room spun slowly, like a bad dream stretching itself out. You stole from us, my father said finally, desperate now. I shook my head. No. I reclaimed what was already mine. Emily started crying quietly. My mother reached for her. My father looked around like someone searching for an exit that had disappeared. You don't understand what you've done, he said. This could destroy us. I stood up and picked up my bag. No, I said. What you did already did that. I just stopped pretending not to see it. As I walked toward the door, my father called after me. You think this makes you smart? I paused, hand on the doorknob. I never needed to be smart, I said. I needed you to stop underestimating me. Then I left. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't shake. I sat there for a long moment, hands on the wheel, breathing like I'd just surfaced from deep water. My phone buzzed. Then again, calls, messages, missed calls stacking up like proof. I didn't answer. Because the next part wasn't about them anymore. It was about what happens when people who have been running a long con realize the person they ignored was the only one paying attention. And they were about to learn just how much I knew. The first voicemail came from my father's lawyer. Not his voice, not yet, but a man who sounded like he'd been paid to sound calm. He said my name carefully, like it might explode if he rushed it. He asked for a return call to clarify a misunderstanding. I deleted it. The second voicemail came from my mother, crying this time, voice thin and breathless. She said she was worried about me, said she didn't recognize me, said families don't handle things like this. I listened to the entire message, then archived it. The third call came from a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. Thomas Reynolds. Same measured tone, same careful words. "They've contacted us," he said. "I assumed they would," I said. "They're claiming fraud." I smiled to myself. "Of course they are. There's nothing actionable," he continued. "But it means the quiet part is over." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm calling you back now." We met again 2 days later, this time in a conference room with no windows. Legal people love rooms like that. Nothing distracts from the paperwork. Thomas slid a stack of documents toward me, thicker than the last one. "Once this proceeds," he said, "there's no reversing the exposure." I flipped through the pages without reading them. I already knew what they said. I'd written half of them years ago, indirectly, through choices and filings and small corrections no one questioned. "That's fine," I said. "I didn't build this to hide it forever." He nodded once. Then we proceed. What my family never understood was that the check wasn't the reveal. It was just the trigger. The real leverage was the trail. Every shell account, every misrepresented balance, every time my name had been used to make something look cleaner than it was. I had copies of everything, time-stamped, cross-referenced, boring enough to be devastating. And now the systems they trusted were waking up. The IRS letter went to their house first. I know because Mark texted me a picture of it like it was a threat. "What did you do?" he wrote. I didn't respond. Then came the bank freeze. Then the audit notice. Then the polite but relentless requests for documentation they no longer had. My father called me from his personal number that night, not the house phone, not my mother S. "Ashley," he said. No nickname, no joke, just my name. "We need to talk." "We already did," I said. "You don't understand how this works," he said. "People like us don't just get audited." I almost laughed. People like us, as if I still belonged to that category. "They do when the paperwork tells a different story," I said. "You're enjoying this," he accused. "No," I said honestly. "I'm finished with it." He went quiet, then softer. "You're tearing this family apart." I thought of every dinner table laugh, every eye roll, every time my silence had been interpreted as stupidity. "You did that a long time ago," I said. "I just stopped holding it together." He hung up. The story leaked faster than I expected. Not the full story, not yet, but whispers. A local business forum picked up on a private asset dispute. Then a regional finance blog mentioned an internal trust correction that unexpectedly shifted control. No names at first. Just outlines. But outlines are enough for people who know how to read between them. My mother's charity board suspended her pending review. Mark's venture lost 2 investors overnight. Emily's fiancé called me, voice shaking, asking if there was something he should know before the wedding. I told him the truth. He thanked me. He didn't call again. The hardest part wasn't the fallout. It was watching them realize that the version of me they'd built their confidence on never existed. That the dumb one had been a convenient fiction. That their certainty had rested on my silence. One afternoon, I found a box on my doorstep. Old things, childhood things, report cards, drawings. A participation trophy from a science fair I didn't even remember entering. On top was a note from my mother in careful handwriting. "I didn't know you were paying attention." I sat on the floor and cried then, not because I was hurt, because it was too late for that sentence to matter. The official investigation took months. Quiet interviews, document requests, people using phrases like unintentional misrepresentation and patterned oversight. My father aged visibly. Mark stopped posting online. My mother stopped calling. I kept working. I kept my routine. I didn't move houses or buy cars or change my name. I let the money sit where it was supposed to sit, doing what money does when it's finally allowed to be honest. One morning, Thomas called again. "It's done," he said. "Done how?" I asked. "They've agreed to a settlement," he said. "No admission of wrongdoing, assets restructured, oversight imposed. And my position? Untouched," he said. "Strengthened, actually." I thanked him and hung up. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the wall for a long time. No fireworks, no triumph music, just a quiet end to a very long lie. That evening, my father sent one last message. No subject line, no greeting. "You were never dumb." I stared at the screen, then locked the phone and set it face down. I didn't need the correction anymore, because the world had already adjusted its story. The article didn't use my name at first. It didn't need to. Anyone who mattered already knew. It called me a previously overlooked beneficiary, which made me laugh out loud when I read it at my kitchen counter with cold coffee in my hand. Overlooked was the nicest word anyone had ever used for me. The piece ran on a national finance site, the kind people pretend not to read but check obsessively. It talked about a quiet restructuring, about how a mid-sized acquisition unexpectedly consolidated under a single individual who had never sought the spotlight. It mentioned patience. It mentioned documentation. It mentioned how the most effective power shifts don't announce themselves. My phone started ringing within an hour. Old coworkers, former classmates. A woman I'd sat next to in high school chemistry who once asked if I was slow or just shy. Everyone suddenly remembered me clearly. Everyone had questions. I didn't answer most of them. The second article named my father, not harshly, not dramatically, just factually, former advisor, subject of review, cooperative, that word again, cooperative. It stripped him of the authority he'd worn like armor his whole life. The third article named me, Ashley Miller, age 38, Ohio-based financial strategist. No adjectives, no qualifiers. Just facts. My inbox filled with interview requests, podcasts, panels, people asking me to tell my story, to frame it as inspiration, to make it clean and digestible and motivational. I declined all of them except one, a small YouTube channel run by a former journalist who understood pacing and silence. He didn't want a soundbite. He wanted the long version. We filmed in a quiet studio with neutral walls. No dramatic lighting, no music cues. He asked me why I waited so long. "I wasn't waiting," I said. "I was working." The clip went viral anyway. People latched onto the title they gave it. "They called her dumb, she let them." Comments poured in, some angry, some grateful, some painfully familiar. Women, middle children, quiet kids. People who learned early that being underestimated was safer than being challenged. My mother called after that, not crying this time, tired. "I don't recognize our lives anymore," she said. I closed my eyes. "You never recognized mine." She didn't argue. Mark sent a message too, longer than the others, apologetic in the way people are when they've lost leverage. He said he'd always assumed I was okay with the arrangement, that I seemed happy being out of the way. I didn't respond, because being out of the way had never been the same as being absent. The strangest part was how calm I felt. No vindication, no hunger for more, just space, like a room that had finally been cleared of furniture I never chose. I accepted one board seat, one. I set boundaries. I kept my job for another 6 months because routine grounded me. When I did resign, my boss hugged me and said, "I always knew there was more going on with you." I smiled politely. He hadn't known, that was the point. At Thanksgiving, I didn't go home. I rented a small cabin instead and cooked for myself. I ate slowly. I slept deeply. I thought about how strength had been framed to me growing up as volume, dominance, quick answers. I thought about how wrong that had been. Strength, I'd learned, could be silent. It could wait. It could let people show you exactly who they were before deciding what to do with that information. A month later, I received the final document, official confirmation, full ownership, clean lines. No footnotes. I placed it in a folder and slid it into a drawer. I didn't frame it. I didn't celebrate it. I just let it exist. Because the real victory wasn't the money or the exposure or even the apology that never fully came. It was this. I no longer had to explain myself. The strange thing about being underestimated your entire life is that silence becomes familiar. When people stop interrupting you, it feels almost rude, like they're waiting for something you're not sure you owe them. After the articles, after the calls slowed, after my name stopped trending in places I didn't know existed, the quiet came back. But it was different this time. It wasn't imposed. It was chosen. I noticed it first in small ways. In meetings where people paused and looked at me expectantly. In emails that started with, "We'd value your perspective." In the way strangers listened all the way to the end of my sentences. It should have felt validating. Instead, it felt disorienting. I wasn't used to being heard. For years, my safety had been invisibility. Being overlooked meant I could observe without consequence. It meant I could think without defending my thoughts. It meant no one demanded certainty from me. Now certainty was expected. Opinions were requested. Confidence was assumed. I had to decide who I was without resistance shaping me. One afternoon, I visited my old neighborhood, not the house. I wasn't ready for that, just the street. The sidewalks were narrower than I remembered, the trees smaller. The world I'd grown up in had shrunk without my permission. I sat in my car and watched a woman unload groceries from a minivan, her kids arguing in the backseat, life continuing with no awareness of the story that had unfolded a few blocks away. That anonymity felt like mercy. I thought about the girl I'd been. The one who answered questions, slowly not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was checking it from every angle before releasing it. The one who learned early that confidence wasn't about correctness, it was about speed. And speed had never been my strength. I realized something then that surprised me. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had trained me. Every dismissal had sharpened my patience. Every insult had lowered my need for validation. Every assumption had taught me how dangerous certainty could be when it wasn't backed by attention. I didn't hate them for it. Not anymore. I met with a therapist for the first time at 40. Not because I was broken, but because I was changing. She asked me what I wanted now that I didn't have to prove anything. I didn't know how to answer. Success had been defined around me my entire life, never by me. I had slipped into power quietly, but power still asks questions. What do you do with it? Who do you become when no one is pushing against you? I started saying no, to boards, to interviews, to people who saw me as a symbol instead of a person. I started saying yes to strange things. Pottery classes, long walks without headphones, sitting in cafes doing nothing and not apologizing for it. My father never reached out again. My mother sent birthday cards. Mark sent updates about his job search like I was a resource. I let the distance stay. Distance wasn't punishment. It was maintenance. One evening, I received a message from a young woman who said she'd grown up being called slow. She said she'd watched the video 3 times. She said it changed how she saw herself. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. That mattered more than the money, because what I had reclaimed wasn't just assets or dignity, it was narrative control. The ability to define intelligence on my own terms, the freedom to move at my own pace without being mistaken for weak. I didn't announce my next steps. I didn't need to. Real strength doesn't rush to be seen. The drive to my parents' house felt surreal. The roads were the same, the stop signs familiar, but everything else had shifted. Not the house, they hadn't touched it, but me. I wasn't the girl who shrank at their words anymore. I wasn't the quiet placeholder. I was someone they no longer controlled, and I carried that with a calm weight. I parked in the driveway, windows up. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the paint dulled, the lawn a little too neat. For years, I had avoided it because the air inside always felt heavy, like inhaling someone else's expectations. Today, I wasn't inhaling. I was observing. I stepped onto the porch. The door opened before I knocked. Emily, she froze. Not with fear, not exactly, but recognition. That sudden pause people have when the sibling they've always underestimated suddenly becomes someone else entirely. "Ashley," she said softly. Her voice trembled just slightly. I nodded. "Hey." She stepped aside, letting me in. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon polish and old carpet. Family portraits lined the walls. Me in braces, Mark with his championship trophy, Emily smiling like she always won. I didn't touch the photos. I didn't need to. Memory was enough. We walked into the kitchen. My parents were there, my father in a cardigan, mother with a towel over her shoulder. They had clearly been expecting me. Not this calm version, not this composed version, but someone fragile. Someone they could manage. I wasn't that person anymore. "I wanted to see it," I said simply. "See what?" Diane asked. "The house," I said. "The place where I grew up. The place where I learned patience." My father's eyes narrowed slightly, as if I had introduced a riddle in plain English. "Patience," he said, voice low. I nodded. "The patience to watch, to record, to wait. The patience that let me survive." Emily shuffled her feet. "You don't need to." "I need to," I said. "I'm closing the chapter." No one argued. No one interrupted. For the first time, I controlled the rhythm of the conversation. I walked slowly through the rooms, touching nothing, saying nothing. Each step was a reclaiming of space. The living room where they had joked about my mistakes, the dining room where they had laughed at my slow answers, the study where they had hidden documents from me, they were all still there. But they no longer held me captive. In the study, I stopped in front of the desk where my father had signed papers in my name, the papers that had quietly funded my future without my childhood understanding. I smiled faintly, almost to myself. I didn't need to touch them. I already knew their story. I already had the receipts, the confirmations, the proof. "I'm done," I said, voice low but firm. "Done noticing your assumptions, done living in the shadow of your certainty." My mother's lips trembled. My father's face was unreadable. Emily watched silently, unsure how to respond. No one moved. Silence stretched like a taut rope, not threatening, but tense enough to make air heavy. Then I turned and walked toward the door. I didn't wait for apologies. I didn't wait for explanations. I didn't wait for their validation. I opened the door, stepped onto the porch, and breathed deeply. Outside, the wind carried no judgment. Inside, the house remained theirs, but I had reclaimed the part of it that mattered. My presence, my story, my calm power. I left without another word. Driving away, I realized the lesson was simple but powerful. Closure doesn't require confrontation. It doesn't demand revenge. It only requires attention, patience, and the courage to reclaim your own narrative. From that day on, every step I took forward was mine alone, unshadowed, unassigned, unstoppable. I woke up the next morning in my apartment like it had nothing to do with the house, my parents, or the money. The sunlight spilled across my kitchen counter, coffee cup still warm from the night before, and for the first time in decades, the world felt quieter, not because people stopped talking, but because I no longer felt compelled to answer to them. I didn't post updates. I didn't announce anything. I simply existed in the space I had quietly carved for myself. I returned to work the next day. My colleagues noticed. Not the old admiration or surprise. They had assumed I was competent, but not formidable. Now, they paused before speaking, waiting for my perspective, which gave me a strange kind of calm authority. I realized that leadership didn't have to be loud. Sometimes it was observing and knowing when to act. I started small projects no one expected. Restructuring budgets no one had the patience to understand. Finding inefficiencies in contracts no one cared to read. Each time I left the credit for the ideas ambiguous, letting the results speak for themselves. It was intoxicating in a quiet, careful way. Outside work, I found unexpected allies. People who had been overlooked, underestimated, or silenced in their own lives gravitated toward me, sensing that I understood what it felt like. A fellow accountant, quiet like I used to be, started seeking my advice. A local entrepreneur who had been ignored in meetings asked for mentorship. I offered guidance sparingly, deliberately, but fully. It felt like reclaiming power without needing to dominate anyone. I also discovered that freedom was more complicated than money. Owning assets, controlling a narrative, and proving people wrong were empowering, yes, but freedom required letting go of old grievances too. I started journaling about my childhood, writing letters to my younger self that I never intended to send. I described every dinner table insult, every moment of invisibility, and every tiny victory I had secretly achieved. Writing it down, without expectation or witness, was profoundly liberating. One night, a friend from college called. We hadn't spoken in years, but she had followed the story online. "You're different," she said. "I am," I admitted. And not because of money. Because of what? Because I stopped pretending I'm someone I'm not. I stopped shrinking. I stopped letting people tell me who I am. I finally listened to myself first. The next few months were gradual and steady. I began investing in ventures I believed in, small tech startups led by underestimated women and quiet innovators. I joined boards not for prestige, but to learn, observe, and contribute strategically. Every decision was intentional, every move measured, because I understood how invisible leverage worked better than anyone I knew. Then came the invitation that would change the next chapter of my life. A major financial conference reached out, offering a speaking slot. The invitation wasn't to inspire, not yet, but to analyze the patterns of oversight and misjudgment in asset management, to reveal the lessons of patience and observation in strategy. I accepted not because I wanted attention, but because the message mattered. I wanted to show that power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it listens. Sometimes it quietly holds the game together until the right moment. The night before the conference, I sat on my balcony, looking over the city lights. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel defined by someone else's narrative. My parents' assumptions, my childhood labels, even the viral story, they existed, but they no longer controlled me. I realized that being underestimated had been a gift disguised as cruelty. It had allowed me to build without interference, to observe without pretense, to act with precision when the moment demanded it. And as I prepared for the stage, I understood that my real story wasn't about money or revenge. It was about reclaiming my life, reclaiming my attention, reclaiming my voice. The conference hall smelled faintly of coffee and polished floors. I walked onto the stage without fanfare, without announcement, and took my place behind the podium. The room was filled with people who expected a keynote, a soundbite, maybe a viral anecdote. What they got instead was quiet attention. I began speaking in my normal voice, measured and calm, telling the story of oversight, of patience, of being underestimated. I didn't dramatize the money. I didn't paint my parents as villains. I framed it as observation and consequence, as power unnoticed and underestimated. People leaned in. Some scribbled notes. Some nodded slowly. Some frowned, uncertain how to process authority delivered without bluster. Halfway through, a journalist in the front row raised her hand. "But don't you feel vindicated?" she asked. "You proved them wrong, gained millions. Don't you feel like showing off?" I shook my head. Vindication is loud. What I learned is that real power doesn't need applause. It waits. It listens. It acts when the timing is correct. Everything else is noise. There was a pause, and I noticed it. That silence, the kind that fills a room when people realize they are listening too closely to someone who isn't performing, was potent. It allowed every sentence to land. Every word carried weight precisely because it wasn't padded with theatrics. After the session, the questions shifted. Instead of personal curiosity, they were professional, strategic. How do you identify inefficiencies unnoticed by others? How do you maintain patience in systems designed for speed? How do you balance observation with action? I answered them. Each answer was deliberate, each one a reflection of decades spent unnoticed. Every time I spoke, I could see the subtle recalibration in their eyes, The moment they realized that quiet attention is not weakness, it is leverage, the day ended. I walked off stage into the hall where conference attendees mingled. People came up to me, CEOs, junior analysts, women who had been underestimated their entire careers. They asked advice. They shared stories. And for the first time, I realized that my influence wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about notoriety. It was about perspective. But then came the unexpected test. A prominent investor, well known for aggressive acquisitions, cornered me in the hallway. He was charming, confident, used to getting immediate answers. "Miss Miller," he said, "your story is fascinating. But tell me, if someone underestimated you now, what would stop you from taking advantage?" I looked him in the eye, steady. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. Patience has power, not impulsive action." He blinked, not the response he expected. Most people answer greed with greed. I answered strategy with patience. By the end of the day, my presence had shifted more than my words. People started to approach me differently. Junior employees listened. Executives paused. Even the press began to ask questions about lessons, not gossip. Later, when I was alone in my hotel room, I realized something. This stage, this public exposure, was only another layer of the same test I had been navigating my entire life. Observation, restraint, patience, and action. Everything else, the ridicule, the viral story, the family dynamics, had been preparation. Power doesn't announce itself. Authority doesn't require permission. Influence doesn't depend on applause. And the final lesson was just beginning. To wield it responsibly, quietly, and decisively, without needing recognition. I sat in my office one morning, sunlight spilling across the desk, and for the first time, I realized that the biggest question wasn't about money or exposure. It wasn't about the viral story or my parents. It was about me. What do I do with this life I had quietly built while everyone else assumed I was powerless? The phone rang. Not Thomas this time, not any of the lawyers or reporters. A small startup CEO I had been mentoring called. She was asking for investment, guidance, and permission to move forward. That one call crystallized it. I could help shape the future quietly. I could choose the projects, the people, the outcomes. I didn't need to dominate. I didn't need the applause. But the temptation was there. I knew it. I could rewrite reputations, manipulate deals, assert control, and make people bend. The same patience and observation that had built my fortune could also bend others, lives to my will. I felt the familiar tingle, that old rush of vindication. But this time it was different. I didn't need it. I was free to choose. I looked at my parents' names in my mental ledger. The family that underestimated me, that built their confidence on my silence. I could take more. I could make them dependent, fearful, grateful. I could leverage them endlessly. I didn't. I decided something I had never allowed myself before. I would move forward, but I would define the terms. I would extend influence only where it mattered, only where it built, not destroyed. I would mentor, guide, invest, and protect, but never to punish. I called Emily that evening. She answered on the first ring, nervous, as if expecting a reprimand or some hidden agenda. "Hello," I said. "Ashley," she whispered. Emily," I said. "I want to help, not control." Not judge, just guide. Her voice trembled with relief. I never knew if you even wanted anything to do with me." "I do," I said, "but on my terms. Not because you expect me to." We talked late into the night, not about money, not about past mistakes, not about viral stories or family shame, but about ideas, dreams, and possibilities. For the first time, I realized influence didn't require fear. It required clarity, patience, and choice. The next day, I walked into the office and made decisions that surprised even me. Investments in overlooked talent, projects that others had abandoned, teams that had been underestimated. I didn't announce them. I didn't post about them. I acted quietly, deliberately, letting results speak, and the world noticed. Slowly, strategically. Not because I forced attention, but because power, when exercised without noise, becomes undeniable. Months later, I checked the newsfeed. Articles still mentioned the $47 story, but in a new context. Ashley Miller, strategic investor and mentor, quietly shaping the future. People began to associate my name not with a viral, overlooked underdog story, but with results, influence, and calm authority. I sat back in my chair and smiled. For decades, they called me dumb. For decades, the world assumed silence was weakness. For decades, I waited. And now every decision, every move, every investment, every quiet influence confirmed it. Real strength doesn't announce itself. It waits. It observes. It acts, and then the world catches up. I woke up that morning without an alarm. The sunlight was soft, the city humming faintly outside my window. No deadlines pressed, no obligations screamed for attention. For the first time in my life, I was fully present in a world I hadn't been forced to navigate through other people's expectations. I made coffee, slow and deliberate, and sat by the window watching the street below. Children were walking to school, couples hurriedly commuting, someone was jogging in the park as usual. Life moved on, indifferent, and I realized that was exactly how it should be. My life had finally caught up to me, not dictated by anyone else, not defined by old labels, but entirely my own. The phone rang. It was Emily. She sounded calm, grounded, even confident. "Ashley," she said, "we've finally started planning the foundation we talked about. I think it's going to matter." I smiled. "I'm glad. Are you coming?" "I'll be there," I said, not to supervise, not to prove anything, to participate, to support on my own terms. Later that week, I walked into the conference room for the foundation meeting. I didn't need a podium. I didn't need slides. I didn't need to announce myself. People listened because they already knew I was steady, deliberate, patient. Influence without bluster is magnetic in a quiet, unshakable way. The Foundation's first project was a mentorship program for underestimated professionals, women who had been overlooked, people who had been silenced. I had spent decades watching, learning, waiting. Now I was finally in a position to give others what I had longed for: guidance, strategy, and the subtle art of quiet power. That evening, I sat on my balcony again, looking at the city lights. The memory of my parents' house, the dinners, the dismissals, the assumptions, was there, but it no longer had weight. I had stepped out of their story and written my own, quietly, deliberately, and without anyone's approval. I realized then what I had truly gained. Not money, not viral fame, not the thrill of vindication, but freedom. Freedom to think, to act, to guide, to invest, and to influence without expectation. Freedom to exist as myself, fully, deliberately. And the lesson I had learned, one I would carry for the rest of my life, was simple. Real strength does not announce itself. It waits. It observes. It builds quietly. It chooses action deliberately. And when the time comes, it acts, and the world finally catches up. I poured another cup of coffee, breathed deeply, and smiled. For decades, they had called me dumb. For decades, the world underestimated me. And now, at last, I had proved something far greater than money or status. I had proved that patience, observation, and deliberate action are more powerful than noise, arrogance, or early assumptions. I was no longer the quiet one. I was not the underestimated one. I was the architect of my own life. And that, finally, was enough. If you've watched my story all the way through, thank you for listening. I hope it reminds you that being underestimated doesn't mean you're powerless, and that real strength is patient, quiet, and deliberate if you want to hear more stories like this. More lessons about patience, observation, and turning silence into power. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Hit the bell so you never miss an update, because the next story might just change the way you see the world. Thank you for being here with me. And remember, sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the cards.